Welcome everyone this evening to the Digital History Seminar. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Matthew Nichols, who works at the University of Reading. Matthew's a classicist, and his research, he tells me, focuses on books and libraries. He's going to tell us something today about something that very much started off as a hobby and then became first part of his teaching and secondly a core part of his research. Just so everyone in the room knows, we are streaming live this evening, so when we do get to questions and answers, just bear that in mind when you're asking your questions. And I'll hand over to Matthew.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you all for coming, corporeally and virtually. It's a pleasure to talk to you. I first became interested in computer architectural modelling as a way of presenting research on books and especially ancient library buildings in a visually satisfactory way, showing how I thought ancient libraries functioned and looked by recreating them on my computer. First as part of my DPhil as a student, and then latterly as published research work on that subject. And my work on books and libraries is still part of my research work. I teach on this subject, including in a summer school here in this very building, the London Road Book School. And in doing that, I noticed what a positive impact these models have on students, not just explaining the appearance and function of an ancient library building, but showing it with something like this. You might recognise this as the Library of Celsus in Ephesus in Turkey. The facade is still there, or reconstructed there by the Austrian archaeologists. But with a digital model like this, we can put back the statues, fill in the inscriptions in red, fly inside a reconstructed building and see perhaps something of how it might have appeared when it was new. So starting with library buildings, I developed, as you say, as a hobby initially, and then as a teaching application, luckily as a research application, which is mostly what I'll be talking about, an interest in the visual modelling not only of individual buildings, but of entire cities. And I'm working on a large reconstruction of the city of Rome as it appeared in the early 4th century AD. That's this one here, which we can fly into. So this is Rome in the era, more or less, of Constantine. And I intend to talk this evening about how I've done this, how I've gone into the project, the sorts of use to which I put it, mostly about research, that was a brief for the seminar, but also substantial pedagogical and outreach commercial impact uses as well. But by the standards of some archaeological reconstruction work, this is relatively imprecise and impressionistic, but it has to be because it's the entire city. And given the nature of the subject material and the existence or absence of evidence for some buildings, which we'll talk about, and the necessary interdisciplinarity of the workflow involved in creating the model, and the fact that I've done it single-handed, more or less, means that this level of detail feels about right to me for this project. But I'm sure we can go to any single building, and if you're an expert in that building, you could say, well, yes, but maybe you could change it this way, and that would be interesting constructive feedback I'd take on board. What is the goal of this project? Digital reconstruction is still a relatively new discipline, development, but reconstruction and the question of methodology and practice raised by reconstruction have been part of the toolkit of archaeologists and historians for as long as those disciplines have existed, and of artists since at least the 16th century, with people like Piero Negorio and Etienne Dupirac. For as long as people have been encountering the ruins of the ancient past or ancient descriptions of buildings, they've been wanting to deduce and then convey an impression, that deduction of what these buildings look like when they were new. And digital modelling simply adds a new tool to that toolkit, which helps compensate for and expand upon some of the merits and also some of the demerits or shortcomings of traditional methods. So here, for example, is the same building in several media, Bars of Diocletian from Rome, the early 4th century in Rome. Two-dimensional ground plans, black and white, very useful for consistent scale and an overview of the building, but I find some students and certainly some tourists and the general public sometimes find these ground plans not as revealing as they might like them to be about how these buildings look when they were new. So we can go to physical models like that, the lovely Gismondi Plastica of the entire city, which is in a museum out at the end of one of the tube lines in Rome, and I saw on its website today it's shut in Restauro with no opening date on the website. So hard to get to and difficult and expensive to maintain, don't have to dust it. So these models are great but limited. So to these we can add perhaps also digital reconstructions, my own model of the same bathhouse. And the nice thing about digital work is that unlike 2D ground plans, it gives us an idea of vertical dimension and mass, the original appearance in 3 dimensions, and it's manipulable, editable, immersive, usable in a variety of ways. Perhaps it lends itself more to this kind of thing where we can make it partially transparent and overlay it on Google Earth and see how this bathhouse has shaped bits of the modern city of Rome. There is the bus park outside Termini Station, those that know Rome. Those are buses on the left-hand side, which gives you an idea of the scale of this building. And when we've done that, we can do this and take away the modern city and fly into the building and see it now not in 2 dimensions, but in 3. So this seems to me to be a useful and interesting tool. As you see here, you can separate out different structures from the map and look at buildings in isolation. I think of particular interest, particular relevance to the seminar tonight is the ability, though, to look at the city as a whole, not at individual structures in isolation, but to look at entire buildings. So, for example, this is a picture of the digital model, and we can just fly around it and look at the city as a whole. So the Forum and Imperial Fora, down here, the Colosseum and the Bathhouse complexes on the Escalade, and above it, forming a sort of entertainment quarter with the Circus Maximus down here. You can go up to the pleasure and parade grounds of the Campus Martius with those theatres. We'll come back to those: gardens, porticos, temples, art galleries, lakes, ponds. Or we can go down the Tiber River past Tiber Island there to a more rough and ready working class part of town behind the Aventine Hills, this harbour zone full of warehouses, customs buildings, a mountain here made out of discarded amphorae sherds, and a practical infrastructural part of the city. So we see different neighbourhoods and their different characters. And we see buildings in relation to one another, not standing in isolation. So we come back to the slide set. How do I do this? How is this done? A bit of method. Individual buildings are made from the best available evidence that I can find: archaeological ground plans, ethnographic material, inscriptions, presentations on coins, pictures of them from the ancient world, literary descriptions, and comparisons to other like structures. So here is a cutaway of what I'm currently doing, which is a model of the Baths of Caracalla there. We'll come back to that a little later, with interiors, all in black and white at the moment. Colouring in comes later. Having made individual buildings, I then line them up on this GIS map of Rome, so that their relative scale and position is all correct. And this is what the entrance to looks like, faded on top of that modern map. So it all ought to be transferable into a GPS-driven system for, say, a smartphone app later. It should be totally interchangeable with modern maps of the city. And that integrates into an overall city model in a way that I'll come back to talk about later. There are lots and lots of challenges inherent in a project of this scope and nature, and they're not resolvable challenges always without conflict or compromise. You can sometimes answer one question at the expense of raising another, and sometimes there just are no right answers. There's a sort of cost-benefit analysis that one has to do about various aspects of the project. So there's potential here, but there are pitfalls too. It looks, I hope, shiny and exciting, but that is only useful if that's the goal. Realism is an illusion if what we want to talk, for example, about is how scholars find partial evidence and combine lots of different sources, some of which might contradict each other, and arrive at a best guess. If it all looks cinematically real, there's a danger there. Eye-catching and pretty is only good up to a point. And that sort of conflict between realism or sort of certain cinematic appeal as against doubt and method and underlying data was focused for me in a discussion I had particularly with the BBC when I was making some graphics for them for documentary on Rome in Scotland. And it's come up subsequently, and I've licensed this to television channels who sent it off to their own VFX houses to pull it apart and play with it and do cinematically exciting things with it, which I have no control over. But it's been interesting to see how the needs of, for example, television broadcast companies differ from the priorities of a scholarly topographer of ancient Rome. So we need to align competing priorities, or at least be aware of them: realism, doubt, the nature of the evidence, the kind of impact that we want to have. And this brings up a set of methodological questions at the outset, which you have to decide about, or it's maybe best to decide about, in a rational and documented way, which is kind of something I grafted onto this project later. As I said, it started as a fairly eccentric at the time hobby and goal of recreating the whole city. And if I went back to square one now, I might lay out for myself more clearly certain questions that really only arose as I was making the project. But I hope I've revisited and rectified inconsistencies where I found them. One question that we need to ask, for example, is what level of detail to put into this. Detail is very expensive. It takes a lot of time to draw the detail in. It takes the computer quite a lot of resource to shine the light on this detail and cast the shadows and render it. For example, one Corinthian column in the model might contain 50,000 vertices, 50,000 separate points, making up essentially triangular faces that if you stand far enough away from it, looks like a Corinthian column with its foliage and its fluting. So that's quite a detailed model in itself. If you then have a couple of hundred of those in any one building, you start running into tens of millions of faces to compute. And if the computer has to assume that these columns are made of a marble that is partly absorbs light and partly reflects it, and it casts a shadow, and each acanthus curl casts a shadow on the column right behind it, it starts to get very difficult to compute and takes a lot of time to do the drawing, the rendering. So an appropriate level of detail needs to be determined at the outset. How close in are you going to get? You decide that, you're sort of fixed in how close you can get without it starting to look quite jagged and blocky and wrong when you're getting closer. Allied to that are questions about how much background detail to add to buildings or areas. Should there be dirt? Mary Beard was keen on dirt being into this model, the master of that, and sort of daily life and grime. And reconstructions do often incorporate these elements, and they can look very good. But how speculative, how cinematic do I want to be? I don't think of this as a moment frozen in time, a particular Tuesday afternoon in the forum, where all the people are there, the smoke is rising from the chimneys, the scaffolding is on the buildings, there are people in togas wandering about the forum space. I think of this really as an architectural massing model. Having said that, there's some detail I have to put in. I didn't put vegetation in to start with. It just looks wrong. Pine trees are such a part of the look and feel of Rome, and they have an important effect on sight lines and the overall mass of the hills in particular. So I did have to put trees into it, but I haven't put people into it, and you might detect in that an inconsistency. With their sculptural programs, here on this coin you see the transverse coloured Temple of Concord from the Roman Forum, which the Mumia views as incomplete without its sculpture. You see the acroterial sculpture program on the roof, the cult statue inside the cellar door, the flanking statue on the steps. So to make a building like this without some attempt to show the statues would be wrong and give a false impression of what the building was. The statues are difficult to incorporate. They include huge numbers of polygonal faces. Organic modelling is a difficult skill, and is really beautiful statues are outside my competence. So what I've done here is put suggestive humanoid figures, and as long as we don't look too closely, they give an impression of the presence of statues, but they don't make a claim for more detail than we know about, because all we see from the coin is, after all, outlines of humanoid shapes. So I hope they give an impression without a pretense of complete verisimilitude, which would be a statement too far. And another question, what date should we set this model at? So those of you that know the Larga Argentina, so-called complex of Republic and Victory temples in central Rome, this area was about 500 years old by the notional date of the model in the early 4th century AD. And it had undergone repair after repair, so bits of it were much older and shabbier than other bits. And creating or choosing a notional date for this complex is therefore a difficult thing to do, especially when you consider that it exists alongside some elements in the model that are brand new. So one of the latest buildings, newest buildings in the model is the Arch of Constantine. We know that relief panels on that arch were taken out of Trajan's Forum elsewhere in the city. So any model that includes both Trajan's Forum and the Arch of Constantine should show the Forum complex, in a state of some disrepair, as if its sculpture had been levered out for use elsewhere in the city. But what if the user of the model is really only interested in Trajan's Forum? It would be a shame to create a Trajan's Forum that looked shabby and semi-derelict. So I've arrived at the useful but disingenuous compromise of a notional date in the early 4th century when everything looks more or less brand new. And that is, of course, a fiction. It's a travesty. The city never looked like that at any one moment in its history. But as a set of architectural massing elements and of individual buildings that can be studied in themselves, for themselves, that seems to me the best approach to take for a single model. What I'd really like to make now is a series of diachronic models so that we can do proper change over time. But it took me 5 years to make one Rome, so we shall see. Another challenge, how do we do urban backdrop? If we just look at the major monuments known from literature and excavation and isolation, we get something like that. These stand up stark and bare. The lowland level plains stretch far away either side of them, and it gives you a good impression of the monuments. But this is not a city, is it? It doesn't show what I think we need to show, which is realistic urban clutter framing these buildings and creating a contrast between the rational, symmetrical, open imperial precincts and busy clutter that surrounded them, the quotidian humdrum, winding, organic, mazy Rome that constituted what most people lived in and experienced most of the time. So I needed to find ways to reconstitute this missing background, and here's to create something like this. If we fade it in, that's what I've ended up with. So the monument's framed within that backdrop. So what we see here is a living city. How did I do it? This is a time lapse of the way I experimented with and thought about adding and creating these different elements. This is a couple of years' work condensed into 30 seconds or so. Buildings going in, blocks being experimented with, vegetation going in, the ground plate being coloured. How do we do this when there's so little archaeological information actually about day-to-day living in ancient Rome? The buildings that made up most people's dwelling places, workplaces, shops and so on were much less substantially built to start with than the major monuments, and then of much less interest to most archaeologists through most of history, so that up until the 20th century, bits of them were being bulldozed to make way for modern building projects, especially after the reunification of Italy in 1861, with Rome as a new capital, secular capital city. It expanded very rapidly, the railway came to Rome, great swathes of archaeological remains, previously lying dormant in fields and vineyards outside the inhabited core of the city, were destroyed. An excavation was really only possible then for major monuments, things that were attractive and important to, for example, Mussolini in the mid-20th century, so he demolished Renaissance and medieval quarters to get to the, as he saw it, the best bits lying underneath. So overall, there's much less evidence for the background clutter, as I've called it, of Rome, the shops and houses and apartment buildings that we know characterise most of the city most of the time. So to fill all that stuff in, we have a series of questions. How do we know where ancient streets ran? Where buildings and districts have vanished entirely, how do we fill in the blanks? Should we even try to fill in the blanks? Well, one of the nice things about digital modelling is you can turn it all off if you don't like it, which is what I've done. But by and large, I do want to have it in there, and I want the right kind of mix of buildings, the right kind of materials. Well, there are some sources we can use. There are a few surviving traces. So here is a building called the Araceli Insula, turned into a church, the church demolished inevitably by Mussolini to reveal the imperial building behind. And you can see there a partially completed model of that structure. One of the nice things about digital modelling, incidentally, is you can do stuff like take the roof off to see the room divisions inside. Where else do we turn for the background detail of the city? Rodolfo Lanciani's very beautiful map of the city in the late 19th, early 20th century conveys to us quite a lot of material that's now lost beneath the city streets. So we can look at that. There is the Baths of Diocletian again, this time with the area around it, which I modelled partly from what Lanciani shares on his lovely black, red and white plates of the city maps. And there's also a little bit of archaeology in here. The ringed in red on the picture is a little city quarter, block and a half of streets there that came to light during the expansion of Rome's railway stations. So there's a combination of Lanciani, the big monument that we know about pretty well, the Baths of Diocletian, a little bit of urban texture whose rhythm and forms I've taken as a kind of keynote for the area around it that I've modelled more speculatively. You might want, for example, the stuff that we know about firmly to be in colour and the stuff around it maybe to be in white or semi-opaque or something, and we could do that too. But for now, I want to try and give an impression of the city as it may have appeared from a pretend Roman helicopter in the 4th century AD. Another source we can use is this, the Forma Urbis, which is a marble map of the entire city of Rome. I think this is just the most wonderful and interesting and exciting thing. Originally about 18 by 13 metres, made under the several emperors in about 203 to 211 AD, carved on marble plaques that were then displayed, as you see here, on a wall of a big monument in Rome, probably to do with a tax survey that then was turned into this monumentalising display of total knowledge of the city. And about 10 to 15% of that map survives in 1,186 marble fragments that have turned into a wonderful jigsaw puzzle for Roman topographers for a couple of centuries now. This is Rodriguez Almeida's synthesis of where all the known fragments and locatable fragments go on the original map, and you can see that most of it is a void because the fragments are missing, but where they survived, we don't know where they went within the jigsaw. So what I've done, and I think as far as I know I'm the only person to have done this, is to take all of the located known fragments of the Forma Urbis, to turn them into 3D models and to put them in the city where they should be. So where we have 3rd century former Urbis data for the city, I've used it. Here's one example. This is fragments 543A to D, a series of 4 fragments that can be very convincingly jigsaw puzzled together. So this is a bit of the city that fragments belong together. Where did they go? We know where they went because study of the grain of the marble and the clamp holes on the back and the nature of the building shown within this fragment convincingly suggests to us that we can put them here where the the Viminal and Kispian hills meet. And we can be fairly confident that the main street in this fragment is the Vicus Patricius, a street running northwards up a valley between those hills to the Viminal Gate and the old Republican city walls. So we can locate that fragment. And what we see on the marble plan, I hope this is visible in the room, maybe you'll come across in the video, is a nice mixture, a fairly typical mixture. Some big portico complex up in here, this double row of dots is a row of double colonnade. Some sort of planting, I imagine this square U shape, probably concentric hedge planting or something like that. But then down here, more quotidian, everyday buildings. These are a series of 3 identical atrium villas, built presumably by some speculative developer or the police. These looks like warehouse and shop buildings, these single chambers opening off to the street. This staircase here shows that the levels are changing, and therefore this must be in a hilly part of the city, which is one clue to its identification. And when modelled in 3 dimensions and located in the city, we end up with this. So there is that portico complex with its hedges. There are the 3 villas next to one another. There is a street run diagonally across the picture with terraces climbing the hillside. That staircase you can see. Warehousing and commercial buildings probably mixed in among the residential and monumental, which is fairly typical for Rome. A nice mixed-use, mixed-character part of the city. And it felt like a really good fit. It really did work here, which I realise is a risk of creating a circular argument. I made it so it would fit, and then when it fitted, I was really pleased with it. But it did seem to me to fit the topography and the character of the city in this part of the map. The villas tuck in very neatly on the gently rising ground, and then the staircase and the terrace rooms take us up the hill as it gets steeper, for example. There are considerable difficulties that attend this process of turning the fragments of the former Urbis into 3D models in a realistic geographical space. For a start, the marble map is not made to consistent scale and alignment. Its ancient carvers varied the scale, either deliberately or by accident. They varied the alignment. So it shows the city flattened out to a single story and marked out in flat 2-dimensional space, which of course was not true. There are no contours, there's no differential shading for elevation, there's no breaks between structures that actually occupy different heights. And positioning fragments of it against the modern city topography is very hard to do accurately because of these shortcomings within the ancient map when it's used in this way. And I have to say, in modelling and then locating all these fragments, I came across quite a number of inconsistencies between and even within published work on the former Urbis. It's just difficult to make it match up as neatly as we'd like to. But overall, it seems like a worthwhile and interesting thing to do, to take this ancient source, to use a modern technique to visualise what it shows us, and then to try and put those fragments within a wider context. Here's another example, part of the S Cohen Room this time, going from fragments published in Caratoni, 2D planimetry, 2D black and white geometry, and then all dropped onto the right terrain heights and coloured in. And there is that district around that circular pond, modelled from those fragments of the former Urbis behind the bars of Trajan. So there are sources we can consult, but the sources are fragmentary and sometimes mutually inconsistent. So at some point, I have to engage in acts of creative fiction to fill up the entire model of the city. And here's a methodological conundrum. Should I improve the overall urban feel of the city by introducing invented material? What takes priority? At the moment, I've wanted to make the whole city, for the kind of research I'm going to come on to talk about in the last few minutes of the talk, an overall feel for the various rhythms that make up the built environment of the city. But I realise that that comes with compromises, and that it'd be perfectly valid to critique the model on the grounds that parts of it are made up, but they just have to be if you're showing the whole ancient city where most of it's disappear. There's other sorts of material we can put in alongside the former Urbis to try and make sure that the 2-dimensional data from the former Urbis is turned into a 3D model that preserves the feel and tone of a Roman city. We can go to places like Ostia, where the buildings survive to a decent height, and we can get a sense of materials, fenestration, streetscape, the way the buildings address the street. We can go also to places that might be comparable to the feel of ancient Rome in other ways. So Palermo, for example, similar mix of building materials and heights, apartment blocks with ground floor shops opening onto enclosed courtyards at the back, brick, timber, plaster, stone and tile. The same sense of monuments like the Opera House where they shot the last scenes of Godfather 3, poking up at the end of these busy, cluttered streets. If you imagine away the ironwork and the air conditioning units, this is probably something like what bits of ancient Rome felt like. So it can be useful for thinking anyway about what you're going to try and show. There's a lot of this to do, so I had to create a workflow that allowed me to create a large volume of urban backdrop as swiftly as possible. It still took a number of years. So this is the tool that I use. This is a video screen grab of the main software that I use for the actual modelling work, which is called SketchUp, made by a company now sold by a company called Trimble in the States, and used a lot by architects, landscape architects, hobbyists, and a few academics like me. The video here is speeded up, but only by a factor of 4, so 2 minutes of video here is about 8 minutes of time, which is what it took to create this simple but I hope reasonable model of a Roman villa from Roman Britain. And you can see what I'm doing here. You start off with a scanned ground plan. There are various tools that you use for drawing in 3 dimensions, and in a moment we'll see colour and texture being added to the building as well. And while this video is playing, I will, if I may, briefly plug a couple of events that I have coming up funded by the British Academy. If anyone watching this feels that this is a technique that would be useful for their own research or teaching, I'll be running a workshop in the winter term next year, about December time, where people who want to have a go at it can come, and I'll teach the basics of SketchUp in a day or so. I teach my undergraduates how to do this already, and they can go from 0 to pretty credible models in a term of tuition. So a day workshop ought to be able to get a taste of it. For those already engaged in digital visualization of their own, I'll be running a colloquium at Reading about digital visualization for the humanities, again, British Academy funded, in spring 2016. My email's on the slide, and I'd love to hear from anybody who would be interested. What I'm doing now is searching for some appropriate textures in the pre-made library of doors and windows that I've made to cheat and put in doors and windows quickly into this villa. And there we go, in 2 minutes times 4, I created a reasonable model of the Bedlam Roman villa. And using these tools, I create the buildings individually, use a piece of software called Cinema 4D for stitching them all together into a whole city and then doing all the complicated lighting and rendering of the model. And what we end up with is something like this, part of the campus marshes with its mix of theatre buildings, houses, warehouses, dockyards, and so on. This is, of course, a God's eye view, and most of the pictures we've seen so far have been God's eye views. I said a notional helicopter a while back. Observation from on high is also something of a topos with an ancient account of the city. Pliny talks about it, for example, Strabo talks about it. It's clearly something Romans like to imagine, or where they could, to climb up a hill or a column or a high point and have a look for themselves. And I think that's a fairly fundamental human pleasure, actually, looking at a city from above. But that's only one way of using the model. And what most Romans saw most of the time is, of course, not a top-down view, a sort of panoptic view, but a street-level view or interior view, a more messy and contingent view where sightlines were blocked or occluded or kept shifting as you walk down the streets. And one of the virtues of a model like this is our ability to put our notional camera anywhere inside the model, or as we've seen, to animate a track over the city or through the city and see something of what an ancient viewer would have seen. So for the last few minutes, I'll talk about some research applications that take this tactic and that correspond, I think, to trends in modern scholarship on the city. The edited volume on the left, Lawrence and Newsom, Rome, Ostia, Pompeii, Movement in Space, asserts movement through the city as a key variable in the way we study it, and talks, along with other books on the screen elsewhere, about how we can study the ancient reception and understanding of the city's topography through texts and other sorts of account, match it up to the archaeology, and think about how certain architectural assemblages or armatures were created and animated and experienced by ancient viewers. And this urban experience is becoming more of a part of our responses to the architecture and environment of ancient Rome. So Diane Favreau's urban image for Augustan Rome in the middle there was an important early exponent of this, with the imaginary journey she wrote through the city to Augustan-era architectural monuments. Supplemented by what we've come to call the spatial turn in scholarship of the city, the viewer or visitor's movement through an experience of the city as an entity that moves around them and their view shifts as they walk through it, really corresponds very well to what an immersive digital model can do, where we look at sightlines and vistas. And in the JRA supplementary volume on the right, the Hasselberger volume, Favreau called for more digital reconstruction as an academic pedagogical tool, as laboratories for experiment, in which she writes to seize the question, which is what I've been trying to do. Not to give definitive answers, but to use visualization at least to ask some questions and suggest some approaches. Because the model is only fairly recently completed, a lot of what follows is relatively new or work in progress, but I'll sketch out some of the ways we've been looking at it for you. For instance, Amy Russell at Durham and I have been using the model to create vistas that correspond to what ancient viewers might have seen as they worked through spaces like the Roman Forum, for example. Here, of course, the lack of human and animal figures in the Forum, in my model of the Forum, the lack of those elements of dirt and daily life that I was talking about before tell against the realism of what we can achieve. But all such reconstructions involve choices for and against what we might broadly call realism. The ongoing Digital Roman Forum project run at Berlin at the Humboldt University, for example, puts in lots of lovely architectural detail and puts in human figures for scale and massing, and even puts in vegetation, but totally eschews any kind of colour or texture. So there is a choice that they've made, different to mine, that includes some elements that we might call realistic and includes others. So there's always compromise. With that in mind, Amy and I made some renders to investigate what one would see walking through the Forum on one possible route for the Triumph, through the Triple Arch of Augustus, past the Fasti. Down there is part of a picture of the Capitoline Fasti, but I've scanned it as a texture onto the side of the building there. Through Augustus' Triple Arch, if that was where it was, past the steps of the Temple of Concord, Castor and Pollux, and on into the Forum, where viewpoints of old and new monuments align and shift as you walk through. Things like the Lacus Curtius over there come into view and then out of it as you walk through. The more recent honorific columns answer and frame the facade of the Basilica Julia here. The Temple of Saturn, one of the oldest temples, down at the bottom there, framed and sort of in dialogue with other monuments around it. That Temple of Saturn thought to date back to the time of the kings and would later become one of the last bastions of pagan culture in Rome as Rome moved towards Christianity. And at the far end of the Forum, the Arch of Septimius Severus closing off to some extent, dominating that space down in the bottom right-hand corner as we view it here. And Amy writes as follows: even if we cannot hope to recover the full effect, we can say with confidence that the triumphal route thus provided not just a path through the confusing whirl of memories congregating around the Forum, but a way to link the Forum to other places of memory elsewhere in the city. The route linking these places redolent of Rome's past, allowing a participant or spectator to read and find his own place in a larger narrative of patriotic service and Roman glory extending across but detached from time. So using the model is helping us check our hypotheses here about what an ancient viewer would have seen, show our viewers what we mean. And we look to the imperial fora, these individual high-walled separate precincts that go to enormous trouble to line up axially, coaxially with each other, even though one to the other you can't really see that from within each forum. The viewer's experience is more like this, a single complex enclosed by high boundary walls. And we also looked at matching up ancient views to Renaissance vedute of the city in ruins, to stand where the notional Renaissance engravers stood, and to show how movement through that zone is totally different in antiquity to what it became in early modernity, because the structure crumbled away, leaving any fragments and vestiges of itself. So we used the model, Amy used it in her article, I provided the illustrations, to explore movement through and memory of the city in various ways. And it was useful for that, though you might well say that here the model is illustrating a series of hypotheses or arguments rather than generating those hypotheses. So we're now working on a joint project presented in Amsterdam next month, in which the model plays a more active part. We're interested in the visibility of certain cardinal elements within monumental complexes in Rome, and how those would be visible or invisible from different directions and distances. So we've picked two large and conspicuous monumental complexes, the Basel Caracalla and the Temple of the Deified Claudius in this instance. And what we are wanting to think about is how ancient architecture is experienced by and large from ground level, and that Roman architects were capable of speaking to audiences in and around the buildings at street level, but also to people looking from further afield, from different directions, or maybe from the city's hills. And that computer reconstruction of these complexes allows us to capture something of that and to discuss it and to see something of what an ancient viewer might have seen. So replacing these God's eye views with something a bit more street level, not quite, but a bit more. These are work in progress views, so they're a bit spartan. You see that the bars are kind of colored, that the dominant effects from street level, here I've given it a bit of height and distance just to fit this huge building into the frame. But if you imagine yourself approaching that building at street level, what you would see is that enormous arcaded facade. And the elements of the bathing complex within that give its essential quiddity or character as a bathing complex, actually as you get closer and stand under that facade, you really can't see. The great dome of the caldarium, the peaked roof of the tepidarium, the elements that say bathhouse are largely invisible the closer you get to the bathhouse. When you stand back from it, as we're doing a little bit in that view there, you start to see these elements. So we're interested in where that might be visible from within the city. The Temple of Claudius on its high platform, the temple inside that turns out to be invisible from various points on the ground around it, but visible maybe from the Palatine Hill, which is where this view is taken from, whether or not you include that high portico wall around it, which some scholars dispute and say wasn't there. It seems to be indicated on the former Urbis, but imperfectly. So we can make different sorts of model with and without that perimeter wall, and we can see what the temple was looking at and who was looking back at it. Here's a view I made for a doctoral student called Nicola Barra, looking down the Circus Flaminius, interested here on how curved arcaded facades articulate movement through the city and city spaces. So in general, reconstructing the urban environment in its entirety, however imperfectly or approximately, allows us to see that the great monuments of the city were not free-floating detached abstractions, but real spaces, shoehorned into widening streets of humbler residential and commercial buildings, whose appearance to the visitor was conditioned not only by their own architecture, but by framing views inwards and outwards, the neighbourhoods around them, the hills of the city, and so on. And I hope a project like mine therefore has something to contribute to this process of engaging with Rome's urban imaginario. In the couple of minutes that remain in the truncated form of the seminar, I will very briefly talk about a further technique we can use, which is to experiment with differential illumination. This is the act of the inscribed programme of Augustus's secular games of 17 BC, and it gives us a series of events and games at different points throughout the city that effectively set up an itinerary or walking tour through the city, which culminates, in fact, in this space that we're in here, the Circus Flaminius, or Augustus's Theatre of Marcellus. Because it gives us the date and the timetable for these games, we can then go and see what the sun is doing at these times of day. And if we look in particular at the theatrical games laid out in the inscription, we see that it takes us from the north of the Campus Martius down towards the Theatre of Marcellus, some Greek stage plays at around 8:15 to 9:30 in the morning in early June 17 BC. And if we go to Augustus's Theatre of Marcellus and look at what the sun is doing between these times, we get a sense of why it might be that that theatre, this building here, points southwest, whereas all the other theatres in Rome are aligned due east-west. Essentially, these are all for afternoon games, when the sun over here in the west is illuminating the stage and not dazzling the eyes of spectators. This theatre is built for matinees, and Augustus uses it for exactly this purpose in his secular games. Here is a looping animation of the solar illumination of this building at that date and those times. And what we see is that up there, right in the middle of that hour, the sun is nicely on the stage. The shadow, almost like a curtain sweeping across the auditorium, unveils the stage and the orchestra for the hour in which Augustus's College of Priests scheduled the games in that particular building. And as that hour and a half comes to a close, the shadow begins to drop back across the stage, almost like a curtain falling on the performance. Well, we know Augustus was extremely interested in solar illumination in games elsewhere in the city. He built a famous sundial, whose shadow may or may not have pointed at various Augustan monuments on his birthday. He was certainly interested in Alexandrian astrological mathematics, so it was entirely within his competence to arrange something like this. And the fact that his particular theatre building, at the precise hour at which he set games to be played in secular games, is so well illuminated, I think it's probably not coincidental. So there is a very brief look at a way another aspect of this model can be used to investigate not only sightlines but also illumination at different times of day and year. And you can imagine taking this technique and applying it to other sorts of building like bathhouses or public spaces of various sorts. So brisk, but I hope interesting insight into the sorts of ways in which we can use these models, and how a combination of tradition, ancient historical scholarship, looking in this instance at some epigraphy, some inscription, married up to the new technique of digital visualization, with its potential for studying not just sightlines but also light and shade, helps us see why the theatre was built where it was and how its unusual alignment serves it. And I hope that serves as an example of the kind of research benefit that emerges from developing this sort of model. And it should lead, I hope, to possibilities that I and other modellers or scholars of ancient cities and places have not yet foreseen. So with thanks for your patience as I gallop through that, I'll bring that to a close there, but I'll be very happy to discuss with all of you as we wrap up the seminar. Thanks very much for your attention.